fentanyl doesn't come from Venezuela. And there's definitely
cozying up to China and Iran, which are part of that, certainly does.
But again, cozying up to China and Iran, talking about what matters on the world stage, is different from what most people who voted for Donald Trump heard him say, which is, I'm going to focus on Americans. I'm going to focus on groceries. I'm going to put American dollars.
And President Trump has done that. President Trump said he'd cut taxes. He did. President Trump said he'd secure the border. He did. President Trump said he'd get men out of women's sports. He did. President Trump has said he'd lower gas prices. He did. President Trump said he'd make sure Iran did get nuclear capability. He did. He did all those things in 1 year's time. That is certainly making America great again. That is certainly consistent with what he said. And getting a bad guy brought to justice who's had a 5-year arrest warrant, that is certainly consistent with that theme and that message as well. So I think the American people appreciate that. And frankly, I think that's the message we go tell the American people in this midterm election. President Trump and Republicans did what we said we would do.
Nicolas Maduro being tried through the American judicial system, should he have the same rights as American citizens?
Yeah, I think that's why he's being tried in our system. Our system is the best in history, the best on the planet. Of course, that's the best system. And that's where the indictment, the 5-year arrest warrant, came from the Southern District of New York. Jay Clayton signed I read the indictment yesterday, 25 pages. This guy's engaged in all kinds of bad behavior, had a 5-year arrest warrant, was not recognized as the head of the state, ran a narco-terrorist criminal operation, and was cozying up to Iran and China. And he was doing it in our hemisphere, which is just wrong. And so the idea that he's now being brought to justice, I think, is a darn good thing. And I think most Americans see it that way. And they appreciate the decisive action from their commander-in-chief, our president, President Trump, as particularly contrasted with what we saw from Joe Biden.
How are they going to feel about the fact that the president, said that America is committed to rebuilding Venezuela, particularly the oil fields, spending money to do that?
Well, again, I think Americans recognize when that country took assets that belong to American companies, that's wrong. That's all President Trump is saying is going to change in the future relative to oil. I think that makes sense. They took property from American companies. That makes sense that there's going to be some kind of compensation, some kind of reckoning for that. I think that's consistent with putting American interests first, which is what President has talked about since he first, came down the escalator 10 years ago.
He explicitly redefined America first in his press conference yesterday. For a long time, again, people thought it meant spending American taxpayer dollars, not on foreign wars, not in foreign countries, but at home. Now he says he's enacting a new strategy where, quote, American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. That's a shift in his approach.
That's consistent with the Constitution. That's consistent with the War Powers Act. And most importantly, I think it's consistent with history. You can go James Monroe, Teddy Roosevelt, JFK,
he
President
never said
Trump
he was
in our
James
hemisphere.
Monroe.
Well, no, I know, but operating in our hemisphere, that is consistent historically, constitutionally with...
But it's not consistent with what he has said as a candidate.
I think Americans appreciate a commander-in-chief who demonstrates strength, shows strength, and takes decisive action. Think about, contrast the president's actions. What took place 2 days ago? What took place with Midnight Hammer when he stopped Iran? Contrast that with the previous administration. Contrast that with Joe Biden let a Chinese spy balloon fly clear across the country and then shot it down. Do you think President Trump would allow that? I think the American people appreciate the fact that he demonstrates strength and he takes decisive action for the benefit of Americans.
You talk about drugs, and here is something that President Trump did. After the former president of Honduras went through the American judicial process, was found guilty, was sentenced for a whole bunch of really bad things with regard to sending drugs into the U.S., poisoning American children, as you would say. The president pardoned him. How is that consistent with going in?
The president's clear about this, I think, in his press conference. The pardon power, by the way, is exclusive to the president. They can exercise it however they darn well want.
Should he?
And he exercised that way, and he said he thought that the Biden administration treated this individual, the former president, in an unfair fashion, and so he chose to pardon him. President Biden issued pardons for preemptive pardons for people in the January 6th committee. He issued pardon for his family. So this is a power that our Constitution gives exclusively to the president. They can exercise it how they choose.